Hello and welcome to another episode of Brand Retro. Today we're gonna invite Katie Jenison back in, and then we're gonna talk with her a little bit about how to build a successful blog, some of the elements that go into it. Katie is an awesome writer, and she obviously does a lot with content generation, with blogs, and with just helping people get started in that realm. So her insight, her value to what she's going to bring to this conversation is going to be awesome. So let's get started. Hello, Katie, and welcome back. Thanks for coming back on to talk with me about how to build a successful blog. Within our new website, we're going to have a blog out there that kind of speaks to some of the bullet points and whatnot. But today, let's just kind of run through some of the basics and fire away with any questions. We'll just kind of have an open discussion about the importance of and how to build, one that's successful and one that can move the needle for your business.
I guess the place I want to start is why someone would want to add a blog to their website, or why they should if they haven't.
How I would explain that is, I think content is king. I mean, getting content out there is, one of the most important things you can do for your brand and your company. I think, like social media, like websites, I think blogs in some way have become something of a must have, and I don't know that people really qualify why. So because of that, it almost became trendy to have a blog. And what I think is different about that, and not that I don't think it's important, I think blogs are great, and the fact that they did trend and they're still trending to some degree, I think is a good thing. But I think the part that people have to remember about the opportunity within blogging is that you get to tell your story authentically in a way that fits your brand. You get to tell it in your own voice. You get to kind of, almost speak your piece from your own personal perspective. And that's the part that I think gets lost a little bit sometimes, and people forget. I mean, content is content, but at the same time, leverage that opportunity to put your voice out there for your brand.
Right. That, I think, should be the main focus of building a blog for your website. And then the rest of that is just kind of like icing on the cake. You're getting that SEO advantage, you're creating backlinks, it's improving your credibility because you're positioning yourself as an expert by producing that content and showcasing your knowledge about something that relates to what you do.
Right. And I think, to your point, I think positioning yourself as an expert is key in that process. But also, the reality is that everybody that's doing it is also trying to position themselves as an expert in that in that space or that industry. So yes, do that, but also add in that piece that makes it authentic to you, because when you say the right thing or you trigger a certain, emotion in somebody that goes, hey, that's interesting, I want to work with that guy. That's going to be the difference between you and the other guy that positioned himself as an expert.
Right.
So I think it's really important, but it's really critical to not get swept up in just the content piece, but to make sure that it comes off as your voice and your brand.
Right. Yep. You can't just create content to create content. You have to have something to say, and you have to be able to provide value with what you're putting out there. And it has to be consistent with what you're trying to do. So your goals, but also who you are and what you stand for as a brand.
Perfect. Yeah, I totally agree.
And we've talked about the benefits of why someone should have a blog on their website. And I think that if you don't, you should start considering it and take those steps. But what do you think would be the very first step someone should do before they actually launch their blog?
I think the first step is, it sounds a little simple, but identify your target audience and really sit back and decide what that blog is going to be about, what topics you want to cover. I think it's another one of the pitfalls of blogging and creating content sometimes is we just create content to create content. Intention is the most important element to this whole thing. So if you know who you're going after and who your hopefully potential listener is, then you can gear that content towards that person. And then hopefully, not to throw a metaphor in there, but to catch more fish. I mean, you want your message to be received. You just don't want it to get lost. Like you said, there's SEO benefits, and there's aspects of that could potentially get picked up on the search engines to bring them back to your website. But the ideal situation there is to be heard, to get read.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's really important to understand who that target is because those are the people that you're aiming to help in some way or provide value in some way, whether that's helping them overcome something that they find challenging, making their life easier, or just answering a question that they have. You look at Google and you'll type it something in, and oftentimes it's Google answering a question. So, how do I, what do I, where can I? So, those questions are a great way to build content and kind of figure out what your audience needs. So I think it's a really good idea to first look at how you can help your audience. And every blog that you write should have that goal of doing something for them.
Yeah, and I would add to make sure that it includes your unique spin on it.
Hmm.
That's one of the hard things that, as a marketer, as a person who, assists, brands and companies with kind of the steps, the logic, the strategy behind marketing, you're always fighting Google because there's 1,000
Hmm.
different blogs and resources out there that spell it out in 5 steps. They spell it out in these very simple ways, and which is easy to do in text, but it's not necessarily the same when you're trying to execute it.
Right.
So it doesn't make those steps or those references less true. But what I would say is that, as you write your own blog, as you create your own content, to include those basic steps, include the milk, eggs, and bread of this thing so that people understand, it is a little bit of a process, but
Hmm.
within that, make sure that your unique spin on it or your perspective is in there so that they understand the spin or the difference in, oh, okay, so in step 2, I should really be thinking about this, for example.
And if you don't know what your audience needs or what they would find valuable, the best thing that you can do is ask them. There's a lot of different ways to do that. I think one of the most popular is social media, putting a call out on social media asking, what do you want to see? How can I help you? Um, Even if you just look at the facts that you get, what do people constantly ask you about? And you can kind of build content off of that.
Right. And I think the other thing is to just listen. Before I was creating content, for my own brand or my own companies, is I never realized, how many questions you get asked in a week or a month or whatever.
Hmm.
You just answer those questions, you have those conversations, and you move on to the next thing. But every time you get asked one of those questions, pay attention to what the question is. If it's the first time you've ever heard it, if it's a really good question, or if it's one you've been asked 1,000 times.
Yep.
Because as you start to kind of pay attention to that, you'll sense and you'll pick up on a pattern. And
Hmm.
if you're picking up on that pattern, hey, that's a great topic to share with somebody and to put into podcast or blog form.
I think that people get really excited to launch their blog and they kind of miss some of the important steps. Like we said, you can't just put out content to put out content. You have to have a plan. So I think that it's also really important to have some sort of editorial strategy, especially if you have a marketing team. You need to know who's writing what, how they're going to incorporate your specific voice, and kind of like a publishing schedule, even because you want to be consistent and you want your audience to know when they can find new content.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I don't want to discourage people from getting revved up and excited about the stuff that they're doing because
Hmm.
it's good. Get revved up, get
Yeah,
excited.
you have
However,
to be excited.
you have to be excited. However, don't let that excitement or that ability to get so revved up that you just blow past all the stuff you have to pay attention to, because
Hmm.
as the curator and the creator of that blog or that content, you're also responsible to make sure that it makes sense, and B, that it performs, and that C, that it's got some kind of a logic to it. And to your point, sometimes when you map it out, call it an editorial calendar, whatever, but when you map it out and can take one step back, maybe you go have lunch, come back to it, whatever, you can see that now from, a 30,000-foot view, and you can start to see the cadence of it. You can start to see how maybe you've got two topics that are back to back, very similar, and you're like, hey, I should space
Hmm.
that out. Anytime you can come back to that and kind of look at it from more of a strategic standpoint and really space things out and balance it in a way that, you know, kind of helps you drip that content in a logical order, or perhaps it's even in a seasonal order.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're in e-commerce, or depending on what your industry is, sometimes that content or that information you share is more relevant in a certain time of year.
Right.
So making sure you step back to look at that stuff, it's super important. And the best part of it, the byproduct of it, is that you're going to have full confidence in when you're posting and why you're posting, to your point earlier. You know,
Right.
I think a lot of people do get revved up. I think they get excited. They just come out of the gates hot and they're just throwing blogs out there like
Mm-hmm.
crazy,
Yep.
which isn't the worst thing in the world. But if they were to take a step back and come at it a little bit more strategically, they might see better results, and they might see just a better overall response from their audience, just based off of the time of year or when they launched it.
Right. And I think that having that editorial calendar too is really cool because it works so well with the rest of your marketing strategy. So you know what you need to ramp up to with social media. If you're doing like a series of blog posts, you can kind of plan out a couple weeks in advance and kind of tease it so that you can get that hype, and then you're going to have more people who want to look at it when it's live.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. No, I totally agree.
So again, not skipping steps. I see this a lot in some of the blog or the Facebook groups I'm in, where people are getting ready to launch their blog. They're super excited about it. They're telling everybody about it. And it comes the day that they launch, and you get on their website and there's one blog post. And I think that's such a missed opportunity because the less content you have for people to interact with, the less time they're going to spend on your website and getting to know your brand. And so I think it's really important too to have that database of content, or like a content bank even, with a couple, maybe 3 to 4 blog posts already published, so that you can start building those links within your blog, but also give people more content to look at once they're on your blog.
You know, this is what I see with customers, especially if we're building a brand from scratch, is they want to generate and develop everything themselves. So everything's an either or. Like, do I spend time on my podcast, or do I spend time on my blog? Do I spend time on, and the answer is spend time on all of it.
Mm-hmm.
The short answer to that is yes, spend time on all of it. But the long answer on that is you can be the curator and almost the bass drum in this marketing message, but you don't have to play every instrument.
Right.
So if there's people within your team, if there's trusted partners, colleagues, or whatever, map that content calendar out and invite some of those people to guest blog.
Mm-hmm.
Find a ghostwriter to come in and capture your ideas and put it in blog form for you.
Yep.
Find ways to, like you said, find ways to build out that body of work, at least so on day one, you've got some substance there. And then
Mm-hmm.
as you develop your overall plan and as you stretch that out over the course of time, you can then decide, here's the stuff that's really timely and really relevant that I don't necessarily know that can be reused.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the stuff that I can repost this once a year, or I
Yep.
can come back to it once a year and almost freshen it up, or add, my 2.0 version to it, whatever it is. But spend time on generating that content, because it's not an either or. What
Right.
I've found too is if you've taken the time to
Sorry.
develop what those pockets of content are, you can then use that as a springboard for everything else.
Mm-hmm.
I have one client who's he's probably spent the last 2 years just writing blogs. That was his thing. He wanted to generate blogs. He wanted to generate written content, and it actually worked really well for his audience at the time because they were a little bit, I don't want to say less technological, but they were a little bit behind in the fact that they would rather read than listen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, obviously with the course of the last couple of years and everything going on with COVID, and people are listening more. They're listening to more podcasts. They're listening to more YouTube type programming and whatnot. Well, he's now just taken his blog format and used that as the springboard to create podcasts now. So he's
Mm-hmm.
got a list of probably 50, 60 blogs and 2 years worth of content that he can just kind of repurpose and recreate in podcast form. And it gives them two opportunities. It gives them an opportunity to convert it from written to audio, but it also gives him an opportunity to revisit the topic and put his own personal voice on it, his own spin. Hey, here's what's changed since I wrote this original blog. It
Mhm.
just gives them a lot of opportunities to continue the conversation.
And I think it's important too to do a mix of that content that is always relevant with like seasonal content. So like if you're e-commerce, you have maybe like a holiday gift guide or something like that. Those are going to be really heavy traffic generators around that season versus evergreen content that is relevant year round. So people are constantly searching for it.
Right.
And you
And
have that opportunity to capture more people that way.
yeah, but I think again, we sometimes complicate it for ourselves because we want to say, and it's true, man, things change all the time. The industry's always changing and
Hmm.
it's all true. Yeah, the
Yep.
landscape is constantly moving. However, there are always parts of what we do that don't change that much.
Hmm.
Like how we put our socks on hasn't changed in hundreds of years. Although socks have changed, the marketing has changed, everything's changed. But how we
Hmm.
put those socks on does not change. So
Right.
identify those pieces of your business that are like, hey, either A, it doesn't change, or B, it doesn't change that much. I'm going to make that list because those are staple items that I can reteach over and over and over again. And again, listen, because if you're getting asked the same questions over and over from the same clients, or within your onboarding process of a new client, if you're constantly telling the same stories and I got to walk them through this again, that's a huge opportunity to
Mhm,
document that, because now you can say, oh, great question, let me send you a link, and all of a
mhm.
sudden they're reading it and they're like, oh, great resource, I know somebody else who might need this.
Yep.
So if you can position yourself in that way and position yourself as the thought leader, even though it's not groundbreaking information, it's stuff that, within your industry, everybody should know. It still gives you the opportunity to be that guy to point them in the right direction and share a link or something that can be shared with other people.
Yep. Yep. I call that cornerstone content because it's really what your blog is built on or your process even. And I think that's such a cool thing to have too because it can save you so much time down the road when you're constantly answering the same questions over and over again. You're spending all this time crafting an email. And instead you can just put it in a blog post and you don't have to spend that time doing that. And it has so many residual benefits because you have that link.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, I think it also lightens the frustration of having to answer that question 1,000 times.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think we all know somebody. I mean, I see it in my industry. I'm sure you see it in yours. I'm sure everybody sees it where you get asked these questions, and in the back of your mind, you're almost thinking, how do they not know this? But in
Yep.
reality, why would they?
Exactly.
They're not the expert, you are. So it's our jobs to continue to answer it. But if we can find a way to make it more efficient and make that answer more accessible, that's what we should be doing, because again, it changes that whole dynamic of, I don't have to feel frustrated answering that question for the thousandth time.
Mhm.
I can just send them the link and I have the tools and the resources built in
Yep.
to share it in a different way, in a more positive way.
Absolutely. Okay, so after you have your content so you have like your evergreen content, or like a list of content that you can use to keep building blog posts, but then you also have those blog posts already published. What do you do after that?
I'm probably going to say this out of order, in accordance to how we wrote the original blog, but you got to just start writing and you got to start finding your voice and your structure. I mean, I think I'm going to mix two concepts. I think you have to be aware of, what the best practices are for a blog, to not make it too long and to not, completely, make it something where it just scares people off the screen because they don't want to read for 3 hours.
Right.
So I think understanding kind of the mechanics of what goes into a good blog is probably a good first step, or at least one of the initial steps. But then I think it's to start writing and start finding your voice. I know um, you and I work together on blogs all the time, and I think at the beginning, it was probably a lot more frustrating for you because I was offering a lot more input and a lot more changes and a lot more like I was kind of hovering over your shoulder to some degree because we hadn't quite found the version of the blogs that sounded like Cyberdogz or sounded like
Mhm.
me yet.
Yep.
But now that we're, a year plus 2 years down the road, now you're almost writing them and I can't tell the difference whether or not you wrote it or I wrote it. And I mean, we're both kind of in it, but it's like at the same time, I'm like, well, that's perfect. It sounds like the brand. It sounds like the message we want to put out there. And I think that journey, it takes a little bit, takes a while for anybody who's going to go down this road. I think it takes a while, but I think that's part of the process is finding the structure and the voice that works without writing a book every time.
And one of the things that I did, both I do it for clients, but I also do it for myself. So if I notice things that I hear you say a lot or phrases that you use, I write them down because those are things that are going to make that sound like you. And at the end of the day, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
So any words or phrases that you say often, and I do it for myself too, because over, a certain course of time, I notice that I'm saying one thing more than something else that maybe I used to say a lot when I was writing. And, that there's that shift. So you kind of have to pay attention to how things change also. But I think one thing that really helps when you're just starting out and writing your own content is to use voice to text because you can really capture your own voice that way because you can hear it being repeated back to you.
Right. And I think that's a great point. And I think it's something that, we should just stop on, and whoever listens to this podcast should realize that this is a good thing. It's not your ninth grade English class.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see it a lot with, people writing content is like they're rewinding their minds back to ninth grade English and all the rules. And, for me, it was Miss Woodstrom, but like whatever I was told to do or not to do. And it's like, don't do that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
make sure you're spelling correctly and your grammar is there, but
Mm-hmm.
you're not writing an English paper for the ninth grade or 10th grade, whatever you want to say.
Right.
You're generating content that speaks to the industry, speaks to the customer, and sounds like you, sounds like
Mm-hmm.
your brand. So
Yep.
there's a difference. So I challenge listeners, I challenge anybody who's going to, go down this road of, hey, I want to write a blog. Just whatever you do, don't write it like your ninth grade English paper
Yeah, there's a
because
difference between formal and informal
it's
and
gonna sound
blog
dry.
content. Yep.
Yep,
It's going to be super boring to read.
exactly.
Once you start writing, you have to also pay attention to the structure of the blog. So again, it's not like a ninth grade English paper. It's written for online reading. So you have to pay attention to those different elements, both from like an SEO aspect, because you don't want to just write something to write it. You also want to capture those benefits. So you need to make sure that you're using keywords, but you also need to structure it in a way that's easy to read. People can skim it, so using headings, subheadings, using those keywords within the headings, and then also using calls to action because you want your audience to know what to do after they're done reading.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, A, yes, I agree with all of that, but B, I think anybody that goes down this road and is going to start their own blog or are interested in starting their blog, one of the kind of missing components to this, and to some degree, this might be, outside the realm of what people have time for, might be over their head, whatever. But do your homework and do some research on SEO. If you don't, or if you can't figure it out yourself, find somebody who can, because that's a very important aspect of writing
Mm-hmm.
this blog. And I'll just go off on this for a second, but as part of that process, it's using the right words and the right keywords to trigger the ability to be found by the search engine. So like that's
Right.
another kind of ninth grade English thing, is that we're going to want to write this and we're going to want to use big words and we're going to want to use certain words that make it sound, maybe more important than it is or whatever. And yeah, if you got to do that, do it sparingly.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, use a lot of other words that are getting picked up in your industry. So
Yep.
maybe a good simple first step for this is for somebody to just sit down and just start Googling different words, find out what words are being used, how they relate back to certain aspects of the topic that you're trying to go after, and even look at competitors. Look at what some of your competitors are doing from a blog perspective and see what words they're using. Because chances are, if they're using certain words or certain phrases, they've already done the homework. They've already done
Yeah,
the SEO legwork to figure out what's being triggered and what's being found by the search engines. That's
exactly.
exactly what you want to not only get in the game and compete with them, but to overtake them.
Exactly. Yep. And there's a lot of really cool free tools that you can use too, that can make that process a little easier. There's even one, I think, where you can type in a website URL and it'll kind of pull out those keywords that
Yeah.
they're ranking for. So you can kind of cheat that way, which is nice. It saves some time, but I definitely think that it's worth the time to put in to figure out what those keywords and phrases are.
Right. And if not you, find somebody that can.
Mhm.
So
And that kind of goes back to what people are searching for and how they're searching. So you need to know what those keywords are so you can plug them into the what do I do when, how do I find, those are the missing pieces.
yeah. And I can't say this enough. It's one of the most important pieces of the content creation or the blog aspect, is because if it's not getting found, I don't want to say it's pointless, but it's pretty close to pointless. Like, you
Hmm.
have to make sure that it's found and it's accessible.
Yeah. If
Um,
you
unless
don't, it's basically like writing a blog for your mom. Your mom's the only one that's going to read it because she's the only one that knows about it.
Right, unless you have like this massive pipeline of people in an email list or something like that. I mean, that would be I guess maybe the other option, but for most people, they're starting from zero, they're starting from scratch. So that SEO piece is super important.
Hmm. Yep. So speaking of email lists, are you pro or con?
I don't think it hurts a thing. I think emails like blogs I think they were trending for a while. Like, if you don't have an email list, you're failing. And like, I think it became, one of those things that we kind of forgot why it's important. We just knew it was.
Hmm.
And then on the backside of that, you have all this stuff happening on social media and all this stuff happening with people protecting their privacy. I don't want to be on these lists. So I think there's kind of two sides to that coin. What I would say is I think email lists are great. I think they're perfect, but I also think you have to purge them on a regular basis. I think you
Hmm.
have to give your audience an opportunity to unsubscribe and to get out of it. And you should never, ever, ever, ever add somebody who didn't ask to be added.
Absolutely.
So I think emails are great. I think if you have people that are stepping forward and saying, "Yes, I want that information. Please include me on whatever that drip is, whether it's weekly, monthly, whatever," then absolutely, I think it's a very powerful channel. But I also think it's a very uh, delicate channel in how you approach it. Um, Emails are great because if you get that person that steps forward, it's as close to a one-on-one conversation as you're going to get, because
Hmm.
they've said, yeah, I want this.
Yep.
And that's where we talk about personalization and all these different things where you can make it a little bit more unique to that individual. But yeah, they're still relevant, they're still powerful. But like blogs, like podcasts, whatever, I think there's an aspect to it where people have them to have them. And if
Hmm.
they can check that box in their marketing plan, like, yep, we do emails, that's as far as they go.
I think that emails are a whole different beast too because you're providing content again, so you have to figure out how to incorporate that into your strategy without being too repetitive. But also, it is another way to get your content out there and in front of the people that are actually interested in it because those people have signed up for your list. Um, that being said, you have to figure out what your goal is because that's going to determine how frequently you're sending emails, what's in it, and the people that you're targeting to add to your list.
Yep. And the strategy for each is slightly different, but just
Mhm.
like the title of your blog or the content of your blog, you have to be very specific on your subject line of your email and the content of your email and all these different things. Because the goal with both, and really any content, is you have to figure out how to make that digestible and how to make it digestible within their everyday, kind of way of going about things.
Right.
So when you think about emails, and anybody who says they don't do this is probably lying, but when you're sitting at a stoplight and you pop your phone out quick and you're flipping through emails to see what came in, that's like your, 0.2 whatever second opportunity to capture their eye.
Yep.
So whether it's, them checking it, in line at the grocery store, at a stoplight, or at home while they're watching TV, like, you don't have a lot of opportunity to write this grand explanation or this grand subject line that takes more than a couple seconds for it to sink in. It's got
Mhm.
to be quick hitting, and it's got to be digestible. And I say digestible because they have to be able to just discern in a very small amount of time whether or not they even care enough to look at it. And I think we've all done it. And I'm not even saying it's a good strategy, but like when I go through my phone, within a split second, I'm deleting.
Mhm.
I'm look, delete, look, delete, look, delete. And I'm probably missing some good stuff along the way because I'm not taking the time. But that's just how we operate, because the other thing is I know 50 more are going to show up tomorrow.
Yep.
So when you're emailing, and same can be true. It's a little different for blogs, but make sure that this stuff is digestible, that your subject lines, your blog topics, make sure it's all quick to the point and they understand what it is.
Yep. I think with emails, there's different points of conversion. So your first one is getting them to actually open it and then read it. And then the next conversion is getting them to do something, whether it's going to read the rest of a blog post or going to check out a product or whatever. So you have to really be intentional about what you're doing with an email list.
Yes, exactly. And to kind of combo those two, one of the things that we've done with a lot of customers is that we'll take, if they're going to email their blog out to their email list, we do some kind of a structure where it's a teaser of the beginning of the blog, and then it either links off directly to the rest of the story or the rest of that blog, or it links out to the other supporting pieces of content that might support that.
Right. Yep. That's a good strategy, good way to do it. So, how do you build that excitement or kind of like capture that initial audience when you launch your blog? Like, do you have a suggestion for getting people there?
I think it's a combo. I think part of it is attacking some of the low-hanging fruit and some of those questions that are frequently asked, because we all want to see if the answer is the same. So like we all look at like FAQs and we look at some of these questions that maybe even we've asked ourselves, just to see if, person A's answer lines up with person B's. So I think starting there it's a good place, not only to kind of build that cornerstone content like you said, but it also kind of plays into the curiosity of the potential listener, in that we want to see if those answers are the same. What's their take on this?
Right.
And then I think the other thing is kind of being authentic and being passionate when you're writing the content. Because, like you said, if it's boring, nobody wants to read it. So when they read your content, it has to
Mhm.
pick
And
up
they're
on
probably
your
not going to
tone.
come back.
No, so you only potentially get one opportunity. And I think blogs are a lot like podcasts in that you can't necessarily trust that the customer is going to start on blog one or podcast one and go from there. They might jump in on podcast 10 or blog 10, and you just can't really afford to have a boring one, because
Mhm.
the hope is if they jump in on 10, they're going to go back and watch or listen, 1 through 9. But if 10's a dog, they're not going to come back. It's going to be boring, and they're going to be like, I'm good. I'm not coming
Yeah.
back to that.
Mhm.
So you have to bring that passion and that excitement and that authenticity to every one of them, so that they can pick up on the tone and they can go, hey, I kind of like this content and the way they spell things out. I think I'm going to check out the rest. As far as like hype and excitement, I think it's hard to generate, but I think you have to bring it to the table with your social media platforms. You have to promote it on your website. You have to be able to kind of, at least lay down the idea that, hey, I know you guys know what blogs are, but this is different. Here's what I'm doing. Here's why I'm doing it. Here's the answers and kind of the problem I intend to solve with my blog or my podcast or whatever it is. So you have to kind of tell them why they need to be excited, and then you have to be excited for them. So hopefully they get excited.
Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of different blogging platforms out there. And if you're an established brand already, you probably already have some sort of content management system, whether it's Squarespace, WordPress, Webflow. But how do you recommend someone pick a content management system if they don't have one already?
That's a great question. Are you ready for this answer?
I think so.
The first step in this process is be honest with yourself.
Okay.
Most people are going to be like, what does that mean? Right?
Yep.
Be honest with yourself. Do you have the time to deal with a complex content management system? Do you have the skill set to deal with a content management system? So like whenever somebody comes to me and they ask the big debate of, do you think this is better than this, or WordPress is better than Webflow, or Shopify is better than BigCommerce, or, is Hootsuite better than HubSpot? Or, there's all these questions. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not necessarily an either or, because it comes back to the person who's planning on managing it or the person who's planning on working in it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why that matters is because we've all got different time limitations. Some of us are just not that technical. We get in there and we're like, oh my God, this is so complicated. Yeah, well, not for everybody.
Right.
So when we choose that content management system, we first have to be honest with ourselves as to what we can handle or what we're willing to take on. And then secondly, does that tool or does that content management system, whatever, options we're shopping around looking at, does it cover my bases? Because a lot of tools, content management systems, they do 101 things. But if only 5 of those things matter to you, if 10 of those things are what gets you out of the gate, whatever it is, then don't worry about the other 90 plus options.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that must be nice stuff. And, if you're not at the point where that stuff matters, or if you don't have the website framework and the integrations to really tap into the other 90%, then I wouldn't worry about it. Because
Mm-hmm.
the goal is that you remain active and you get content out there. So to sit down and to write and generate this content, to find your voice, to do all the different things that it takes to generate the blog, that's a lot of work already.
Mm-hmm.
Then if the content management tool you've chosen is a big pain in the butt and you hate it, that's one more hurdle you're going to have to overcome. And it's probably going to be the hurdle that makes you just not want to do it.
Right.
So pick something that works for you, pick something that's easy. And, I'm always, kind of helping people, steer around that idea or find those solutions. So, I mean, my email is on this podcast. If somebody wants to reach out, ask my thoughts, get my input on it, I'm more than happy to help. But that is like one of the most critical pieces, because
Mm-hmm.
it can make or break the future of how you manage this stuff.
Right. One thing I think to consider is how your website varies from a desktop version versus a mobile version, because those are going to be important factors. I think like 60% of Google searches are done on a mobile phone. So having a blog or website that pulls up and is easy to navigate, easy to have that easy to read structure. So making it easy to scan, find what you need is super important, because if it's hard to navigate, nobody's going to want to use it. Nobody's going to stay there. They're going to go somewhere else where they can find what they need much easier.
Yeah, I've seen that in different content management systems and even blog platforms within like, proprietary solutions like a Wix or a Squarespace or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
is that they have the frameworks they have or the layout options that they have, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other thing, is that what kind of blogs do you like? What kind of blogs do you think your audience would like? What kind of blog are you aiming for? I would say a good example of this, or one of the things that I've seen even most recently and most often, is that when people build websites, they buy these themes. They'll buy a WordPress theme or a certain framework. That theme only comes packing one or two layout options.
Mm-hmm.
Almost always, the layout option they really want is something else. And now how do we do it?
Yep.
Well, now you're venturing into customization land, and that was one of the things that, had they done a little more homework, or had they maybe ranked that in level of importance, they might have picked a different theme. They might have found one that worked a little bit better for the direction they wanted to go.
Yep.
And now they're at this crossroads of, oh my God, I've got to customize the blog, and I've got to spend time on development, and I've got to do all these things I don't want to do, which
Mm-hmm.
again kind of speaks to that hurdle, is that we want to avoid that hurdle because you've done all this work to get to this point. And now if we make it hard on ourselves to actually get the stuff posted, it's kind of a backwards logic, in that we need it to be easy.
Yep.
We need it to almost be drag and drop, click of a button, because we're ready. We've done all the work, we've written all the content. Now I just want to get it out there.
Mm-hmm.
If that part's difficult, it's usually going to be a deal breaker, or if nothing else, it's going to slow down the rate of, your cadence of how many blogs and how much content you can generate. Awesome. Well, thanks, Katie, again for joining me and talking with me a little bit about, how to build a successful blog, some of the elements that go into it, and kind of what that backstory is behind how to get started. So appreciate it very much. And thanks again for listening.